Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Construction Record Podcast, Halloween edition. As you've heard from all those zombies and groans and what have you, I'm digital media editor Warren Frey, and with me I have
Peter Kenter.
As is tradition. Yes, as is tradition, every year we come together. Unfortunately, Vince couldn't be with us this year, but Peter's here, and he's got a story that he's been working on and just actually got in. So you're getting a sneak peek of it before anybody else, really.
Yeah. So this year I was interviewing Jim Dean, who's the creative director of the Haunted Walk, which is a series of haunted tours that they run in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto. And we talked a little bit about some infrastructure hauntings. Mm-hmm. And it was a fun interview. And the one thing about Jim is that he plays it right down the middle. He is not telling you that these places are haunted, and at the same time, he is not telling you that they aren't either. Mm-hmm. So
it's good business, really.
But the first story that we talked about was the tunnel monster of Cabbagetown, and this was based on a story that appeared in the Toronto Sun in 1979 about a guy who was looking for his cat down what appeared to be a tunnel that was running between two apartment buildings on Parliament Street. And when he looked for his cats, he went down the tunnel, started climbing on hands and legs, and saw something that looked a lot like, from his description, Gollum from Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. Wow.
Telling him to get the hell out of there. Now, what was interesting, though, is Jim talked about this, and he says what was interesting to him about this story is not the guy's claim so much, but the fact that the Toronto Sun had to track him down, and that he reluctantly told his story, because a reluctant witness is typically more likely to be telling the truth than somebody who really wants to get the story out there. So I found that one kind of interesting. We also talked about a bridge in Scarborough, the old Finch Avenue Bridge, and he mentioned that this bridge was built quickly by Army engineers after Hurricane Hazel. The bridge still stands, but he said that if you go across the bridge at a certain time and invoke the words "Happy Birthday, Candy," then you will hear a woman shrieking and sobbing as a result of saying that. Now, he says he got no idea who Candy is, but he says clearly those words seem to have developed some range of power at this point.
I was going to say, wishing somebody happy birthday, I don't want to know the history behind that if it causes a bad reaction.
Yeah, some people have sort of developed a backstory, but he says it's interesting also, that type of story, because the person who is experiencing this kind of haunting has to want to be part of it. So meeting it halfway, they can cross the bridge at a certain time, but having to recite that means that they're actually opening themselves up. They're inviting the supernatural and the paranormal to identify with them. So that was number 2. But what I found particularly interesting here was that they were currently working on an investigation of an entirely different type of infrastructure, and that is the CN Tower.
Oh, okay.
Because, and this is brand new for them, but they were working on, they put a bunch of people and equipment into the CN Tower, and they're doing it on 2 evenings. They've completed one, and now they're doing another, but they're working on this theory that the CN Tower, of course, attracts a lot of lightning during any given year, and it has cables that bring that lightning down into the ground to ground it, and also it transmits signals and it picks them up. So what their theory is if you have these cables going into the ground, is it not possible that all the area around there becomes kind of a conductor for any kind of paranormal activity? And at that height, maybe you are picking up all sorts of things as well through the antenna. So what they did is they brought a bunch of electronic voice equipment and sensitive medium type people up there, and they said that the early indication, although he could not share it with me exactly what they experience, is that yes, the observation pod on the CN Tower is indeed a hotbed of paranormal activity.
Oh, wow. I've been to the observation tower. I saw nothing. I just like to
Yeah,
point
well,
that out.
you weren't there at night.
That's true. I was there during the day, probably around 10 in the morning. So, yeah.
Also, you weren't looking for it.
Also very true. Yes. I didn't have a bias, in other words.
That's right. So anyway, that's coming up, and I have a few more stories in that article. I don't want to give everything away. I want people to read that article too.
Mm-hmm. And they also have a podcast called Haunted Talks, where I would assume they talk about this stuff as well.
Yes, they do. Absolutely.
I didn't have a story to go off of, but I have a grab bag of stuff that I've been fascinated by for years. One of them is when I was a kid, I read this book, Usborne, publisher. I think it's still around in England, but they had these very popular at the time, and then they kind of fell into not disrepute, but just kind of obscurity. Books about monsters, vampires, ghosts, and they had stuff about the future and just really good kids' books, which have now come back, and they've made a point of saying, unchanged in any way, because all the people who read them as kids like me are now in their 40s and 50s. So they're applying on the so I bought these books again. Anyway, one of them is about you can get them on Amazon for like $15-20, something like that. One of them is about Borley Rectory, and Borley Rectory, it was at one time the most haunted place in England. And so imagine like an 8-year-old kid reading this, and it's like a 2-page spread of all the crazy hauntings in this. I've just got the Wikipedia page up here. It was located in Borley, Essex, and there's like, as I recall, there was one woman ghost who would run around screaming, but her tongue had been cut off, so you couldn't actually hear her. She was just a mute, screaming, and then she would disappear if you looked at her. And then there was a nun that would kind of show up, and then apparently that is, as I look at Wikipedia, that's been debunked as something that basically either came from the novels Montezuma's Daughter or Walter Scott's epic poem Marmion. But it just became this sort of thing where it was known as the most haunted place in England. There's been a couple TV shows about it, I believe, like docudramas or actual documentaries about how much of a phenomenon it was. I think it burned down in the 30s or 40s. Anyway, it was a fascinating, especially if a little kid had never been to England. It was like, wow, this is crazy. I got to go visit this place sometime. And then I found out, oh, it's burned down. What's the point? So closer to home, and I can't believe I've never seen this one either. I used to go to San Jose because I had friends who lived there for quite a few times, and I never went to the Winchester House, which was built by, I believe, Sarah Winchester, the daughter of the guy who invented the Winchester rifle. And I think the popular legend is that she kind of started losing it, possibly due to all the guilt from being aired all this, and she kept building onto this house in just haphazard, crazy ways. So it's become a tourist attraction where you just wander around and go through it, and there's no rhyme or reason to any of these rooms. Also, it's supposedly haunted by the people who've been killed by the gun, which I don't know if there's any. Well, of course it's a ghost, so there's probably no proof anyway. But so I always just found that fascinating, and I don't know why I never took advantage of that when I was in San Jose.
Yeah, really.
The third thing I was looking at was I used to go to the University of Alberta, and I think most universities have ghost stories. One in particular was Pembina Hall was just built in 1918, and they claimed that there was a nurse that a spirit of still lingers and runs through the halls of the building, searching for her fiance, who apparently died during the epidemic at the time. And this is not a ghost story per se, but I remember there were tunnels that they're kind of legends. Like they did exist. They were like maintenance tunnels underneath most of the U of A, and because it gets cold as hell in Edmonton in the winter, students were always trying to go down there, and nobody would let them because there was legends that students have died down there or gotten lost or that kind of thing. And I don't think there was ever a ghost story, but damn it, there should have been.
Well, if they let those kids down there, somebody would have died, and it would have been a ghost story.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's what I've got in terms of ghost stories or ghost story adjacent stuff.
Well, the one that I was thinking of right now, although again not ghosty but creepy, and I'd written this up for Daily Commercial News, and it was about the Manitoba Legislature building. Mm-hmm. And I interviewed a guy by the name of Frank Albo who'd written a book about it, and he'd had special access. The government of Manitoba had allowed him to really carefully examine all of the artifacts and the history of building the legislature, because he started looking at different aspects of it. And he noticed, for example, that there were sphinxes on the building. Mm-hmm. And, why are there sphinxes next to the Golden Boy, right? And so he started looking more carefully at the sphinxes, and the sphinxes had actual Egyptian hieroglyphics on their chest.
Oh, wow.
Appealing to the Egyptian sun god Re, and, and having the name of Pharaoh Tutmos III on the inscribed on their chest. And then I realized, well, who's the golden boy? And in fact, he said the golden boy is actually a representation of Hermes. The guy,
Okay.
the guy who built the place was it was a guy by the name of a British architect named Frank Worthington Simon, and he was a grand architect of the Grand Lodge of Freemasonry in Scotland.
Oh, okay.
So he says this whole thing is imbued with unusual meaning, from the arrangement of the tiles to the placement of the dome to almost everything about it, unbeknownst to most of the people who go in there. So
it took us a few minutes, but the Freemasons got in there somehow. So.
Oh yeah, well.
Also, when was the legislature built? Because 30s, 20s, that was kind of the height of Egyptology in terms of just popular culture, imagination of it. That the 70s, I guess, when King Tut stuff went on tour. Oh, okay, so a little before that, but still, even then, stuff was coming back from Egypt. So maybe that was part of it. That it was just kind of part of the popular imagination at the time.
Yeah, even there were representation of sacrificial skulls of oxen on the building at some point.
I don't know if I want that on my place of government, to be honest with you. But
well, and also the number 13 keeps showing up over and over again. Number of stone steps on each of the 3 flights of stairs, number of stones in the archway, number of lights in each hallway, number of rosettes in the palatial room, 13 seats around the speaker's chair, grand staircase hall, the entrances are exactly 13 feet long, and then 666 everywhere as well.
Oh, of course. Why wouldn't it be?
Room 66.6 feet square. The length and width of the entire building add up to 666 feet. So I thought that was pretty cool.
I forgot about the one thing I was going to talk about, the U of A, which kind of goes with the Winchester building. And apparently this is a myth, but I choose to believe it. Of the biological sciences building, I had classes there back in the day. I can still smell the place because bioscience, there's a lot of really bad chemical smells all the time. And so what it was, the legend was that a couple were designing it together. And while they were designing it, or while it was being built, they got divorced. And so as a result, the place is a complete maze. It's impossible to find. Floors don't line up. You'll go to in Being John Malkovich, where they're the 5.5 floor. There's nothing quite that bad, but all of it feels like it could be there in just a slight degree change, and you'd be in that situation. So, but I was looking it up, and apparently that is a myth. But I am really sad to hear that, because it did feel, if not haunted, at least like it was going to drive you crazy. Like it was difficult to find your way out of that place, or in it for that matter. And I don't know if it's changed any in the last 30 years.
Well, I actually visited a house. I cannot say that it is haunted, but it was an unusual experience. And that was that I have an acquaintance, and he owned a house that was built in the 1880s. And he was part owner of it, but the ownership, after his brother died in that house, it was going to go to his nephew. So he said, something, I'm going to be leaving that house. I'm going to take out anything that I want from that place. Mm-hmm. But he says, if you and your wife would like to walk through there and just take anything that doesn't have a sticker on it, you're welcome to have it. So I spent days in this house because I was so fascinated by it. I just couldn't stop going back, because imagine that you're in a house where you see, city directories that somebody may have collected, and they're 100 years old. You think that's a collection, but in this house, these were not collections. These were what people left on the shelves and never removed.
Oh, wow.
For 100 years.
It's like a time capsule, really.
It was a time capsule. So like the bathroom, the kitchen had strychnine, to kill rats. Mm-hmm. All sorts of horrific poisons in there that were that you would never allow people to have today. The house had sports figures from the 1940s and the 1950s tacked up on the wall, because clearly this was a kid's bedroom.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
At that point, and then nobody ever went back. there was still Mickey Mantle on the wall. So
that's just weird. Like, even
yeah,
if it's not a ghost thing, it in a way it is. You know what I mean? Like,
but I will say this, that when I went into the basement with my wife, this place was used for rented out frequently to paranormal type TV shows, and they forgot to remove one of their props. So we went into the basement, turned around, and there's a noose hanging.
Oh, good God!
Right in front of me. I'm like, all right, what's that doing there? This ain't right. So
yeah, no kidding. That's a little on point. So I guess finally, since we always have to somehow shoehorn horror films into this, why don't we each name our favorite movie haunted house and why? And okay. You go first.
All right. Well, I think it would be Hill House in The Haunting, and not from the TV show and not from the second movie, more from the original Shirley Jackson novel. Because what I really liked about the Hill House is that you could not point to any particular aspect of it that made it a haunted house. And the way that it was described was that, I'll read a little piece. Every angle is slightly wrong. Angles which you assume are the right angles you're accustomed to and have every right to expect are true are actually a fraction of a degree off in one direction or another. So that essentially, anytime you walk through this house, you're going to become disoriented. When you look out a window, the view is the wrong view. When you go from one room to the next, it's the wrong room. And essentially, the way that it's introduced, no human eye can isolate the unhappy coincidence of line and place, which suggests evil in the face of a house. And yet somehow a maniac juxtaposition, a badly turned angle, some chance meeting of roof and sky turned Hill House into a place of despair. Nice. I really like that.
For me, I think it's Poltergeist, the movie from 1982, I believe, because A, I saw it as a teenager, which is the perfect time to see it.
Yeah.
And B, it's just, and I'm sure this is at Paranormal Activity and various other movies, but I don't know if it's the first one to have a normal suburban house as, basically a hell pit full of ghosts, or one in particular. But I think it's the best one for that. And the fact that it's a suburban household, and it just... it's kind of like Jaws. The spookiness or like the menace builds up for an hour before all hell breaks loose, right? Which they used to do in the old days instead of some big CG nonsense at the beginning. So like it just starts with like little phenomena here and there, and it's fun because the little girl is sliding across the kitchen, and they can't figure out why because it's not on a slope and all the rest, and it goes and goes and goes, and then she gets sucked up by the TV, and it just works. Every weird normal thing that you're used to every day is out to get you, and that's what I think is great about it. And then it implodes at the end, and the house actually exists. Of course it does, and people visit it to this day. Like I guess the owner is cool with it. He doesn't mind, but it's somewhere people go to all the time because they love the movie so much.
I think what's interesting about that one is that it's not so much that it's the first suburban one, or the first normal family kind of haunted house, but it was a brand new house. And that was what I think made that one different.
Yeah, that's a good point. Also, for all my yelling about CG, at the time, the special effects were the best you could get. So, I mean, it, in effect, was doing the same thing, but it was just a different way of making movies back then. So you didn't have to front load everything. So, which is the death of any horror movie as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I remember seeing the Amityville Horror, which I think came out just a couple of years prior to that. And that one was the first one. Well, I guess The Exorcist told me about this too, but flies are just such a bad sign.
Yeah. Anytime you hear a fly, there's trouble. Trouble's a brewing.
And when you see millions of flies.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just time to go.
All right. On that, it's time for us to go. So thank you once again for joining us on this annual tradition, Peter.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me. I always enjoy it, and I hope to be back next year.